which was then banned from public broadcasting after a lawsuit was allegedly brought against the History Channel by former Presidents Carter and Ford and their friends Jack Valenti, Bill Moyers and Lady Bird Johnson. Of course, this was just more disinformation. What the plotters hoped to achieve was that by getting the series banned, but making it available on the internet, the seekers after truth would be duped into thinking it must be true, precisely because it had been banned from mainstream media. It's a double bluff. It is quite possible, after all of this ludicrous skullduggery, that even the CIA themselves couldn't remember what purpose it was all supposed to serve.
Blame shifting.
But the general idea was that the public was supposed to swallow the notion that Lyndon Baines Johnson was the primary culprit in this entire affair, because he's dead and can't speak for himself. It is absolute nonsense to suggest any such thing. Lyndon Baines Johnson was, like Hitler and Richard Nixon, a mere puppet of the oil men and the merchant bankers and military industrialists, something he finally admitted to.
I can't honestly say that I've ever been completely relieved of the fact that there might have been international connections.
You mean you still feel that there might have been?
Well, I have not completely discounted.
Liar.
The notion that he was the criminal mastermind behind the Kennedy assassination is simply another disinformation falsehood dreamed up by the CIA. He was most definitely involved in the plot and offered up his personal hitman, Mac Wallace, to be part of it, but the men who actually masterminded the plot were Alan Dulles and David Atlee Phillips, with George Bush being the most important figure in the actual execution of the plan, and even they, in the end, proved themselves to be just as crude and obvious as anyone else in the way they took care of anyone who might incriminate them. On the 22nd of February 1967, Eladio Del Valle and David Ferry were both murdered within minutes of each other, when it seemed they might give information to the Jim Garrison investigation. Charles Boyd Harrelson and Milwaukee Phil Aldericio suffered convenient early deaths in jail, and having been ordered to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, both Charles Nicoletti and George de Mohrenschildt were shot dead at the same time on the 29th of March 1977. Having been scheduled to testify before the same committee, Johnny Roselli met a similar fate. His body was found floating in an oil drum in Dumbfounding Bay, Miami, just after Malcolm Wallace was murdered in exactly the same way as Lee Bowers. On a stretch of empty American highway, his car was forced off the road, then CIA agents smashed his head into the steering wheel until he died, to make it appear like a single-car accident. Not long afterwards, Sam Giancana was shot in the back of the head while cooking sausages, and his spy inside the Chicago police force, Richard Kane, was blasted to death with a sawn-off shotgun in Rose's sandwich shop on the 19th of December, 1973. Absolute proof that George H.W. Bush was the most important figure behind these grisly murders and the Kennedy assassination surfaced quite recently in a declassified FBI memo which revealed he was working for the CIA in 1963 and not from 77 onwards, as he'd always claimed. He had been a lifelong friend of George de Mohrenschildt, who had actually begged him for help when he realized the CIA were trying to kill him. It was therefore rather ironic that when the police checked de Mohrenschildt's wallet, they found an address card which gave them a direct lead straight to the guilty party had they but chosen to follow it up. It said George Poppy Bush, his CIA code name, Zapata Petroleum, Midland, Texas. It became a farewell note from the man who coordinated the crime of the century, a man whose father, Prescott Bush, had created the CIA in the first place, along with his friends some 30 years before, purely in order to take care of their own business interests. They arrogantly believed they were more intelligent than anyone. But in the end, the means the George Bush-led CIA chose to silence all the major underworld figures who might incriminate them proved to be every bit as crude and obvious as Ruby's killing of Oswald on television. The whole point of George Bush and his Central Intelligence Agency was that they were supposed to be intelligent, And yet in the end, it couldn't even fool little old ladies.
And who's going to inhibit them? The gangsters that are running this country is going to inhibit somebody.
All institutions of the American government are essentially a gangster syndicate. And everybody knows this. So perhaps it's time now to ask what we've learned and how best we can use this new understanding about the West's secret history to evaluate what is really going on in our world right now. To begin with, let's answer a couple of questions which have perplexed many people over the years. A great many researchers and historians have wondered why the Kennedy family themselves almost seem to be aiding and abetting the cover-up by choosing to be so quiet about the assassination itself. After the revelations of Chuck Giancana, there now seems little doubt that this is because they know a full disclosure of Joe Kennedy's dirty political dealings with the mafia would likely leave the Kennedy name in a very tarnished state. Up until now, history has tended to give the Kennedy patriarch a distinguished and squeaky clean image, which went along with his appointment as the American ambassador to Britain. Like most things about the ruling class, this image is false, because it's clear that Joe Kennedy was every bit as big a crook as his business associate, Sam Giancana. However, it also seems necessary now to revise the entire history of the Kennedy brothers. The reputation of Edward Kennedy never recovered from the Chappaquiddick incident, in which Mary Jo Kopechne lost her life when she drowned in his overturned car when he allegedly drove off this unlit bridge whilst under the influence. At the time, the public believed this was a married man misbehaving, but it's come to light recently that our old friends Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt were seen in the Martha's Vineyard area just prior to the accident. Once again, it's the same dirty people pulling the same dirty tricks. The media's treatment of this affair destroyed any chance Edward Kennedy might have had of becoming president, and we do now have to wonder if this was yet another example of the CIA controlling public opinion. To the same end, it is also now clear why such venerable institutions as the BBC and other prominent European broadcasters have assisted in the cover-up. They always knew the Kennedy assassination was a can of worms, and that if the whole truth in the story were pursued vigorously, it would lead right back to the case of Auschwitz and the obscene profits which Europe's royalty and heads of state made from their investments in slave labour.
Told us when Bush was running
This is a
for
brutal
office.
truth, which the West must now confront, and an equally brutal problem the United States must now face is the question of what has happened to the US military in the intervening years since it murdered its own commander-in-chief. The answer is that America's armed forces are now completely controlled by the American mafia. The mob don't even need hitmen anymore. They use United States Marines as assassins. They are, as Sam Giancana said, one organization who keep a low profile while they control the world as a business. And in an effort to prove this is so, in 1998, Pastor Rick Strawcutter videotaped a quite remarkable interview with Kay Pollard Griggs, formerly the wife of Colonel George Griggs, who for many years was the head of NATO. He was also an alcoholic of that well-known kind, who was shy and unable to communicate when they are sober, but who then cannot stop talking once they have a drink. During the course of a stormy marriage, punctuated by periods of domestic violence, which cost Kay Griggs many black eyes and broken bones, she learned that her husband had been turned into a brutal psychopath as a consequence of his military training, which included induction into what is known as the Pink Triangle, the Cherry Marines. Over the years, far too much has been written about Lee Harvey Oswald. But what is remarkable is that few historians were ever aware that, like most Marines who worked in intelligence, he was homosexually recruited and was part of the same-sex club which included Jack Ruby, George Senator, and David Ferry. Kay Griggs explains that these selection procedures came into the US military when the cream of the death's head sporting Nazi top brass joined the American ranks at the war's end. Ever since then, the Greek and Spartan traditions which Hitler so admired, and which were integral to the German army, have found their way into American military culture and are now manifest in the way that the old skull and bones procedure for identifying and, most importantly, controlling rising stars is now used to select the top brass of the future. In a nutshell, boy soldiers who want to rise in the ranks can only do so by doing favors for the older men.
So George Bush, I mean, all these people rise up to the ranks, the same club. No wonder, you know, I saw a little TV clip one time where a reporter was asking George Bush and others about the Order of the Skull and Bones.
You were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society. It's so secret we can't talk about it. What does that mean for America?
I mean, if this really got out, that these guys are all inducted because they've got some kind of homosexual thing on them.
Indoctrination. I mean, or induction. They have to do that.
Yeah.
They do that.
Yeah. Even
in a coffin. And it's even now coming into the military totally. The chiefs do that. They put them in the coffin. They do the bowling ball trick.
Okay, you gotta explain this. What happens when you get in the coffin? Why do you get in a coffin?
Oh, they get, when you get your eagles, that's a German thing.
Okay.
You know, it's what the German high command did, and most of them, you know, had the boyfriends and stuff, the Krupps and all of that. It is a German thing that they say goes back to Greece, and it's all the male Marine-looking men that they do it with. See? So now the chiefs have to do that. What they do is they get, George said it's like a zoo. They get everybody really drunk, and they sometimes call it dining in. Shellback is another time that they do it. Not everybody does it, but the ones who do it, if they're young, they get right up to the top. It's a...
okay, well, what actually do they do? They've got a coffin, they get inside
anal sex. That. They do... They put them in the coffin, and they do things.
This is how military recruits are now controlled.
Answer the question, lady.
And the mafia military exert a similar hold over all career politicians. At some time on the way up, they are maneuvered into a compromising position, usually through the use of two-way mirrors in a brothel. And once the mafia military have got something on them, the career politicians, judges, senior police officers and media moguls face a stark choice. Either take your payoff, which is usually worth millions of dollars, or go to jail for life for your misdemeanor. It is with these kinds of tactics, first used by Sam Giancana in the 1930s, that what are now known as the five mafia families of the New York metropolitan area, the Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and the Bonanno, control all politics in the United States, and through their business arrangements with the five-star generals and CIA, control all cocaine and heroin trafficking throughout the entire world. After the dust had settled on the Kennedy assassination, Sam Giancana explained to his younger brother that the mob and the CIA had taken care of JFK together because they were essentially two sides of the same coin. In the last 50 years, that relationship between these two secret societies has become even closer, to the point where they are now indistinguishable. The people who live in the third world are so well aware of what is really going on, they have come to call the CIA the cocaine importing agency. The World Wide Web now abounds with proof to back this up. And although many people were skeptical at first about Kay Griggs,